The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, casting everything below in a sickly white wash. 5:47 in the morning. Oak Creek Memorial Surgical Unit hadn't woken up yet, just the skeleton crew moving through the corridors with the shuffling rhythm of people who'd worked the graveyard shift too many times. The smell of antiseptic mixed with stale coffee, that particular Portland drizzle creeping in through the loading dock doors down the hall. Megan O'Brien clocked in at her usual time, her badge dangling from a lanyard she'd clipped to the same spot on her scrubs for 3 years running. She moved through the unit like water finding its level, quiet, competent, invisible. Nobody noticed her arrive. Nobody noticed her check the supply cart or review the overnight notes on the surgical floor. This was how she preferred it. The job was clean here. The protocols made sense. You followed the lines, you saved lives, you went home. No one asked questions about where she'd come from or why her hand sometimes trembled when a door slammed hard enough. No one needed to know about the nightmares or the reason she always requested day shift, away from the silence of nights that sounded too much like waiting for something bad to arrive. Her name was on the patient board in neat block letters, room for 14, Captain James Rivera, post-op day 2 from abdominal repair. She pulled the chart. Surgery had gone textbook. The recovery notes were solid. Stable vitals through the night. She had 6 patients on her rotation, which meant she could spend the time she needed on each one. She ran her fingers along the spine of the chart and felt that familiar click, the one that came when all the pieces of a patient's recovery aligned properly. This one would make it. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the eastern windows. Megan grabbed the blood pressure cuff and stethoscope from her supply bag, moved down the corridor toward room 414. Her boots made no sound on the tile. That was another thing she'd never lost, the ability to move without announcing herself. The habit had saved her life more than once. Old patterns didn't die. They just got better at hiding. Room 414's door was half open. She pushed it gently and stepped inside. The man in the bed was built like the kind of person who still did morning physical training at 53. Broad shoulders, the kind of chest that came from military discipline held for decades. His face was weathered in a particular way, not aged, exactly, but seasoned. Sun damage and wind damage and the specific creasing that came from squinting into places most people would never see. His left arm lay across the blanket and Megan's entire body went very still. Tattooed in dark blue ink on his forearm, so clear she could read it from the doorway, was her name. Megan O'Brien. The letters were precisely rendered, professional work, the kind of tattoo that took 3 sessions and cost real money. The kind of permanent choice someone made when they needed to remember something they were afraid of forgetting. She had perhaps 2 seconds before her professional mask had to be perfect. She used them well. 1 measured breath. Her hand stayed steady as she entered the room and approached the bed with the exact cadence of a routine morning vital check. "Good morning, Captain. I'm Megan. I'll be your nurse today." The man's eyes opened. He looked directly at her, through her, really, the way hospital patients looked at anyone in scrubs. There was no recognition. No spark of memory. Just polite acknowledgement of another medical provider in the rotation. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying that same weathered quality as his face. "How's the healing looking?" "Very good," she said, and she began the checks. Blood pressure cuff on the right arm, the latex smooth and cool against his skin. "You had a solid night. Pain level this morning?" 3. Maybe 3.5. She wrote it down. 106/68. Excellent. She listened to his breathing with the stethoscope, the earpieces cool against her ears, the steady sounds of lungs that worked the way lungs were supposed to work. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was fine. She was fine. The trembling wasn't happening. It was just the early morning chill in the unit. "Let me check your incision," she said, and she began to unwrap the bandaging on his abdomen. The surgery had been clean. The stitches were holding well. No signs of infection, no seroma formation, no complications. The work of a good surgeon, she could recognize that. She'd worked with enough good ones to know. The captain watched her work without expression. "How long have you been a nurse?" 3 years, she said. It was technically accurate. 3 years here. It didn't count the other part, the part that existed in classified files she'd never be allowed to discuss. The part that lived in her shoulder blades and her left knee and the specific angle of scar tissue that ran across her ribs. "You're recovering beautifully. Surgeon should clear you for light activity by tomorrow." "Good," he said. "I want to get back to my daughter. She's been hovering." Megan finished the bandaging and straightened up. "Family support is excellent for recovery," she said, and she meant it. She began moving through her other checks with the mechanical precision that came from having done this 3,000 times. Temperature under the tongue. Pulse. The small confirmations that a human body was continuing its ordinary functions. Everything was ordinary here. Everything was routine. The tattoo on his arm stayed in her peripheral vision like something that had its own gravity. She finished her check, documented everything in the electronic system from the rolling computer station, and was preparing to move to the next patient when the door swung inward with more force than a quiet hospital morning called for. Dr. Harrison Hargrove entered like he was making an entrance at his own benefit gala. 58 years old, expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, the kind of silver hair that came from either genetics or a very good colorist. He wore his white coat like a crown, and he wore his position like armor. He stopped short when he saw Megan still in the room. "O'Brien," he said, and even the way he said her last name carried a specific weight, the weight of someone testing his leverage. "I didn't know you were assigned to Captain Rivera." "Just finishing the morning assessment," she said. "I follow the published protocol exactly," she said. Still quiet. Still composed. Still holding every feeling locked down so tightly it would take specialized equipment to find it. "Is there something specific you'd like me to verify?" He studied her for a long moment. "Just maintain standards," he said finally, and he moved to the bedside with the possessive air of someone who believed the patient belonged to him now. "Captain, excellent work on your recovery. You're progressing ahead of schedule." "Appreciate it, Doctor," Captain Rivera said, and Megan could see him relax slightly at Hargrove's entrance. This was the response Hargrove got from most people, the reflex deference to authority, to reputation, to the kind of power that moved through institutional corridors like a current. She excused herself quietly and moved into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her. The rain continued its steady assault against the windows. She had another 5 patients to check before the day's shift officially began, and she had 17 minutes to get her face back to neutral and her hands back to steady and everything back to where it had been before she'd walked into room 414. The tattoo stayed in her mind like a song she couldn't unhear. She made her way to the break room to review the next patient's chart. The space was empty at this hour, just the fluorescent lights, the ancient coffee maker, the refrigerator full of lunches labeled with permanent marker. She pulled out the file and sat at the scratched table, and she made herself breathe the way she'd been taught to breathe, way back when breathing was something you trained for alongside everything else. Her left hand moved unconsciously to the inside of her jacket, where she kept the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. She didn't pull it out. She just let her fingers rest against it for a moment, feeling the thin fabric and the embroidered anchor through the layers. A talisman from another life. A reminder that she'd been someone else once, someone who made different kinds of decisions, someone who existed in a different kind of light. The rain drummed harder. 6 minutes until shift change. She had another patient assessment, and then the day crew would arrive, and everything would become busier, louder, easier to hide in. She could do this. She'd been doing this for 3 years, showing up, working well, staying invisible, going home to a quiet apartment where the nightmares waited but couldn't follow her into daylight. The door to the break room swung open. 2 nurses from the night shift came in, laughing about something that had happened during their rounds. They stopped abruptly when they saw her sitting at the table. "Oh," one of them said. "We didn't see you there." "I'm just finishing some notes," Megan said. Please, go ahead. But they didn't go ahead. Instead, they exchanged a glance, quick, efficient, the glance of people who understood the hierarchy and knew that proximity to someone on the wrong side of Dr. Hargrove's attention was contagious. They grabbed their bags instead and headed for the door. "We'll grab coffee downstairs," the other one said, though their cups were already in the break room. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Megan returned her attention to the file in front of her, and she made a small notation, and she did not think about tattoos or about recognition or about the way a door could close and leave you standing on the wrong side of it. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That's what she'd chosen, the work, the quiet, the invisible salvation of other people's recoveries. The rain continued drumming against the glass, patient and relentless, and somewhere on the surgical floor, a man with her name written in permanent ink continued healing without knowing why he'd written it there at all. The morning light filtered through Captain Rivera's window, the kind of pale Portland gray that made everything look like a photograph someone had already forgotten. Megan checked his vitals one final time, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation climbing incrementally, the satisfying numbers that meant healing was actual and measurable. She'd been doing this work for 3 years, the invisible work, the kind that left no fingerprints. The kind that saved people without anyone needing to know her name. She was adjusting his line when the door swung open hard enough to make the hinges complain. Dr. Hargrove entered like he owned the room, which, in the institutional arithmetic of hospitals, he did. His white coat carried the weight of legacy. His grandfather had been a surgeon here, his father had been chief of staff, and he moved through Oak Creek Memorial like a man who believed the building had been constructed around his future. Behind him came Captain Rivera's daughter, Rachel, mid-40s, expensive blazer, the kind of composure that came from a lifetime of being taken seriously. "Ms. O'Brien," Hargrove said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry that tone, the one that made colleagues flinch. "I'm ordering a repeat echocardiogram at 1400 hours. I trust you can coordinate that without consulting YouTube." The silence that followed was the kind you could measure in heartbeats. Rachel's face shifted. Not quite a flinch, but something close. Megan's hand stilled on the for tubing. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. After 6 months of this, she knew his rhythm better than she knew the hospital's code system. The cruelty was always preceded by a pause, a theatrical pause, the kind meant to gather an audience. "I actually went to an accredited nursing program," Megan said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of composure that made anger feel like a luxury she couldn't afford. She secured the line with practiced precision and stepped back. "The echocardiogram can be coordinated within the hour." Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting something different, a stammer, an apology, some visible crack in the facade. What he got instead was a woman who looked at him with the same expression you'd use to read a chart. "Your educational background aside, I'll need confirmation that you understand the protocol for post-surgical cardiac imaging before you access the system." "I understand it," Megan said. Rachel cleared her throat. "Dr. Hargrove, my father's recovery seems to be progressing well. Is there a concern?" "No concern at all," Hargrove said smoothly, already turning toward the door. "Just ensuring we maintain the highest standards. Some staff require more comprehensive oversight." He delivered this last line directly to Megan, his eyes carrying the kind of brightness that came from knowing he'd landed exactly the wound he intended. The YouTube comment would travel through the hospital's break room by lunch. It would become the kind of shorthand that followed her into elevators and supply closets. The kind that made people smile when she wasn't watching. The door closed behind him with a pneumatic sigh. Rachel waited a moment, then, "That was inappropriate." "It's fine," Megan said, moving to document the vitals in the system. The lie was smooth, well practiced. After 6 months, lying had become a second language. "He's under pressure. These things happen." But it wasn't fine. It had stopped being fine around month 3. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial occupied a corner of the 3rd floor, beige walls, a refrigerator that hummed like a dying animal, a coffee maker that had seen approximately 4,000 rotations of industrial brown liquid. Megan had always loved this room. It had been her refuge, the place where the machinery of the hospital stopped for exactly 15 minutes. She pushed through the door at 11:06 a.m., exhausted in the way that came from standing for 6 hours while absorbing institutional cruelty like some kind of emotional sponge. 3 nurses, Jackson, Chen, and Morris, were sitting at the round table, their conversation suspended mid-sentence at her arrival. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Jackson stood. Chen gathered her coffee. Morris was already reaching for her phone like it had suddenly developed an urgent gravitational pull. Within 20 seconds, the room had emptied with the precision of a building evacuation drill. They didn't look at Megan. They didn't acknowledge her. They simply ceased to exist in her presence the moment her presence began. The coffee maker continued its mechanical breathing. A fluorescent panel overhead flickered, caught itself, resumed. Megan sat down alone at a table designed for 8 and pulled out the sandwich she'd made at 4 in the morning. The bread was already getting stale. She ate it anyway, each bite requiring a separate decision to continue. By 12:14 p.m., she was walking back toward the surgical floor. By 12:31 p.m., she was standing in front of the unit board, reading. The memo was professional in its formatting, devastating in its architecture. Incident report, nursing protocol violation, the header declared in size 14 Arial. Below it, in clinical language that made cruelty sound like mathematics, was a detailed fabrication. Megan was documented as having administered medication without physician approval, having interfered with established diagnostic protocols, having demonstrated questionable judgment and insufficient deference to attending physician authority. Each violation was meticulously constructed, the kind of architectural malice that only someone who understood hospital systems intimately could design. The report was signed by Dr. Hargrove at the bottom, dated 2 days prior, meaning he'd written it before the YouTube comment, before the break room exodus. This wasn't reaction. This was orchestration. Megan stood in front of the board for 11 seconds. The hallway was mostly empty this time of day, just the occasional nursing assistant moving between rooms, the distant percussion of monitors and ventilators, the ambient hum of a building designed to keep people alive. She took one measured breath, the kind she'd learned to take in a place where breath was sometimes the only thing under your control. A single tear escaped her right eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the memo, because Hargrove had just turned the corner 20 feet down the corridor and she could feel his presence like a change in air pressure. He was watching. He always watched when he'd landed what he thought was a killing blow. Megan stepped back from the board and turned directly toward him. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that he had to move forward to hear it clearly. The kind of quiet that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. A man who needs an audience for cruelty is just afraid of being alone with his conscience. She said it once. She didn't repeat it. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stated it the way you'd state a vital sign, and then she walked past him toward the stairwell, leaving him standing there with the words landing somewhere between his ribs like something he couldn't quite extract. By evening, Megan was sitting in her apartment at 419 Morrison Street, a place that had never quite felt like home despite the 3 years of occupancy. The walls were the color of eggshell, the landlord's choice, not hers. The furniture was functional. The plants on the windowsill were dying because she kept forgetting to water them, kept forgetting that living things required attention she couldn't quite manage to give. On her nightstand was a photograph. Her unit at Kandahar in 2019. 17 faces arranged in 3 rows, faces bronzed by sun that never relented, faces carrying the particular exhaustion that came from knowing that some of your friends would never see their own families again. She'd voluntarily walked away from that life when the nightmares became indistinguishable from consciousness, when every slamming door sounded like mortar fire, when she understood that staying would destroy not just her but potentially everyone around her. She'd chosen this quiet place, this quiet job, this quiet invisibility. No one in Portland knew where she'd been. Not her sister. Not the 3 friends she'd made at the hospital before Hargrove had made friendship toxic. Not Captain Rivera, who slept 2 floors above her and carried her name on his arm like a tattoo of someone he'd never met. That was the cruelest part. He was healing. He was recovering completely. and every morning when she checked on him, he looked through her like she was just another nurse in scrubs, just one of hundreds, just someone whose name he'd randomly selected on a night when he was still half-drugged and remembering things he couldn't quite place. The unit patch was in her jacket pocket. It was faded now, the colors having surrendered to time and washing. She'd sewn it into the lining 3 years ago, the day she'd arrived in Portland. It was the only physical proof of who she'd been: Senior Chief Petty Officer, 17 combat rescues, 3 Bronze Stars, classified intelligence that she'd never spoken aloud in an American city. The patch pressed against her ribs when she breathed, a constant reminder of the distance between her past and her present. A constant reminder that she was being erased so slowly that no one would notice until she'd completely disappeared. At 22:38, her phone buzzed. A text from Rachel Rivera, Captain's daughter. Dr. Hargrove has no authority over your competence. My father asked about you this morning. Asked why you hadn't been in his room. Whatever is happening, don't accept it quietly. Megan read the message 4 times. Then she set the phone down and pressed her hand against the unit patch, feeling the stitching through the fabric, feeling the weight of something that belonged to a person she used to be. By 23:06, she was asleep, and in her sleep, the lines between Portland and Kandahar had begun to dissolve. The call came at 2:13 a.m. A code blew in the emergency department. Multiple GSW casualties inbound from a downtown incident. The hospital activated its trauma protocol with the mechanical efficiency of machinery that had learned this particular dance too well. Megan was in the ER within 11 minutes, her body moving on the autopilot that came from having done this before, in operating theaters with names she couldn't mention, in places where the geography was measured in casualties per hour. The ambulance doors burst open at 2:28 a.m., and chaos arrived in the form of a man bleeding through 7 pressure dressings, his shirt in pieces, his breathing already becoming labored. Behind him came 2 more, one unconscious, one screaming in Pashto, his voice cracking like he was breaking apart from the inside. The ER attending, Dr. Patterson, competent but tired, began calling orders. The trauma team mobilized. And Dr. Hargrove, who'd apparently been sleeping in the physician's lounge, arrived at 2:31 a.m. wearing yesterday's clothes and a confidence that had nothing to do with medical knowledge. GSW to the chest, Patterson called, already cutting through the second patient's shirt. Decreased breath sounds bilateral. Possible hemothorax. Chest tube, Hargrove ordered. 14 French. Now. Patterson nodded to the surgical tech, but Megan had already seen it, the way Hargrove's hands were shaking slightly, the way his voice carried that bright edge of someone trying to sound authoritative while panic was quietly eating him alive. He'd trained in hospitals like this, trained in theory, trained in simulation. But he'd never trained in moments when the margin for error was measured in seconds. The patient's oxygen saturation began dropping. 94, 88. 81. The monitor showed a sinus rhythm, but the numbers were painting a different story, a story that said the chest cavity was filling with blood and the lungs were collapsing and time was moving in only one direction. Get me a second chest tube, Hargrove said, and this time his voice had moved from bright to brittle. But Megan had seen the ultrasound screen, had seen the dark space where air and blood were accumulating, and had recognized the pattern with the kind of certainty that came from having seen it before. Not in Portland. In a field hospital at FOB Shank with a 17-year-old Marine who'd stepped on an IED and a senior officer who understood that the time between action and death was measured in the seconds you didn't waste panicking. Her hands were moving before her brain had finished calculating the decision. She was reaching for the equipment cart, her fingers finding the spinal needle, the syringe, the 18-gauge angiocath. The muscle memory was immediate and total, not learned, but lived. Not theoretical, but earned through experience that predated nursing by a decade. What are you doing? Patterson said, already understanding, already moving out of her way. Pericardiocentesis, Megan said quietly. Cardiac tamponade. The fluids are compressing the heart. She didn't wait for Hargrove's approval. She didn't request authority. She simply moved toward the patient with the kind of certainty that made the room go quiet, and she identified the xiphoid process with her left hand while her right hand carried the needle in the kind of arc that only came from having done this more times than she'd slept. The needle found the pericardial space at a precise angle, and the syringe filled with dark blood, old blood, blood that had been suffocating the man's heart with its weight. The moment the needle withdrew, you could see the change. The patient's oxygen saturation began climbing. 68, 75, 82, 89. The monitor rhythm shifted from the jagged desperation of a failing heart to the more regular mathematics of something that was going to keep beating. The entire ER had gone silent. 16 people, all of them watching, all of them understanding exactly what they'd just witnessed. A procedure that was technically outside a nurse's scope of practice. A procedure that had just saved a man's life while Dr. Hargrove stood frozen with his hand still raised, still reaching for equipment he would never use. At 2:44 a.m., Megan stepped back and let Patterson take over the closure. At 2:22 a.m., she was washing her hands in the break room sink, watching the blood disappear down the drain, watching her hands move like they belonged to someone else entirely. In her head, the desert was still very real. The sound of the code monitor was the sound of rotor blades. The fluorescent lights were muzzle flashes. The antiseptic smell was dust and copper, and the particular kind of fear that came from understanding you were the only thing between someone and permanent absence. She blinked. The desert receded. The hospital reasserted itself. But the person who looked back at her from the mirror above the sink was someone she'd thought she'd successfully buried. The monitor above Captain Rivera's bed beeped its steady rhythm through the pre-dawn silence of room 414. 6:22 in the morning. The kind of hour when hospitals feel like ships drifting through still water, when the fluorescent lights seem dimmer, when the world outside was still asleep and the world inside moved at half speed. Megan stood at the bedpost, reviewing his chart. Post-operative day 3. Bypass graft holding. Drainage tubes clear. Everything by protocol. Everything stable. She'd checked on him at midnight. Everything had been fine. Captain Rivera slept with his head tilted back, one arm across his ribs where the surgeons had split his sternum and rewired his damaged heart. The Navy tattoo on his forearm, her name, Megan O'Brien, rendered in bold military script, rested on the white hospital blanket. He still didn't know. 3 days in this room and he looked through her like glass every morning. She turned to leave. The monitor's beep didn't accelerate. It stopped. Then it flatlined. The sound wasn't an alarm. It was a silence, the absence of rhythm that meant everything. Megan's hand froze on the door handle. Her body turned before her mind caught up. Captain Rivera's eyes had rolled back. His chest heaved once, a reflex, then went still. She moved. The call button was already in her hand. Already pressed. Not a request. A command. The words came out level and precise, code blue, room 414. Captain Rivera. Post-op bypass complication. 2 minutes. The code team was coming. 2 minutes meant 30 seconds of useless time, meant his heart wasn't moving blood to his brain, meant the clock had already started running backward. She didn't reach for the crash cart to do compressions. That was the protocol. That was what the well-trained surgical nurse would do. Instead, she grabbed the backboard and tilted the bed flat, her movements economical, purposeful. Her hands knew this choreography. Knew it down to the marrow. The crash cart stood against the wall. She opened the cardiac drawer. Surgical gloves snapped like gunshots in the silence. She found what she needed in 4 seconds, the 18-gauge spinal needle, a 20-milliliter syringe, antiseptic solution. Her fingers wrapped around them the way they had wrapped around other instruments in other rooms, in a place she'd buried so deep that waking it felt like exhuming a ghost. "What are you doing?" A nurse's aide stood in the doorway, frozen. Getting his heart working again. Megan positioned the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the place where the pericardium lay behind the breastbone like a water balloon around the heart. She felt for the landmarks. Felt for the patient, not the panic. Felt for the certainty that lived in her hands even when her mind was screaming. The needle went in. She pushed. The resistance lasted 2 seconds, then gave way. The syringe filled with dark amber fluid, the blood that had seeped around his heart and was compressing it like a vice. 50 milliliters. Then 60. The pressure around his heart releasing with every draw. O2 sat, she said. The aid didn't move. O2 saturation. Now. 68. It's dropping. The monitor still flat-lined. Still silent. The fluid kept coming. 80 milliliters. 90. The needle steady in her hand like it was guided by something older than thought. This was what 3 years of choking down nightmares had stolen from her, not this precision, but the memory of when this precision meant she was keeping someone alive at a phi base in Helmand province with a field dressing and prayer. The needle came out. She didn't remove her hand from his chest. She waited. 5 seconds. 10. The monitor beeped. Once. Then again. Then the rhythm climbed, 52 beats per minute. Slow. Too slow. But alive. She looked at the oxygen monitor climbing the wall display. 72, 78. The numbers rising like a man pulling himself up from underwater. 82, the aide whispered. 88. The door burst open. 3 people in scrubs, equipment thundering. Dr. Chen leading the code team, already shouting orders, already reaching for the defibrillator pads. She saw Megan's hand still on the patient's chest, saw the empty syringe on the blanket, saw the amber fluid staining the white sheet. What did you do? Dr. Chen's voice came out flat. Pericardiocentesis. Cardiac tamponade. He arrested from fluid pressure. The monitor climbed. 92, the rhythm tightening, organizing, becoming the steady beat of a man coming back from the edge. Dr. Chen checked the chest for entry, checked the monitor, checked the color returning to Captain Rivera's face. The entire code team was motionless. Behind them, through the observation window, the hallway had filled with people. Nurses. Respiratory therapists. 2 residents. The night shift supervisor. They watched in silence so thick you could operate in it. Get me a portable chest X-ray, Dr. Chen said. And whoever did this emergency drainage, you stay. It wasn't a request. It was a command, exactly the tone Megan had used, and the edge of something dangerous flickered across the doctor's face as she recognized the same authority. The X-ray took for minutes. The first images showed the problem, fluid in the pericardium, but the worst of the tamponade resolved. Captain Rivera's oxygen saturation held at 94. His blood pressure climbed from 74/40 to 92/58. His heart, the one the surgeons had rebuilt 3 days ago, was beating in perfect rhythm. Dr. Chen studied the X-ray, studied the drainage syringe, studied the patient's chart. Who's the attending on this patient? Dr. Walsh. He's coming in. And who authorized an emergency pericardiocentesis? The room was still quiet. Megan stood motionless, her gloved hands at her sides. The blood under her fingernails was Captain Rivera's blood. The calm in her voice had been someone else's voice, the voice that had shouted coordinates under fire, that had made decisions while people bled out, that had survived things that quietly competent surgical nurses were not supposed to survive. The patient was in cardiac arrest, she said. 2 minutes from code team arrival. The procedure was indicated. You're a nurse. Yes. Dr. Chen's eyes held hers for 3 seconds. Then she turned to the code team. Get him to surgical ICU. Full monitoring. I want a cardiothoracic consult within the hour. And someone get me the security footage from this room. I need to see exactly what happened. The team moved like a synchronized machine, the stretcher angled under the bed, the monitors transferred, the 4 lines checked. Captain Rivera's eyes fluttered open as they moved him. His hand reached out, grabbing at nothing, still half-conscious. Megan watched him go, watched the name on his forearm disappear down the hallway. The aide who'd been frozen in the doorway was gone. In her place stood 3 other people, 2 nurses and the night supervisor. They'd watched the whole thing through the observation window. They'd watched her hands move in that specific language of certainty. They'd watched her voice drop an octave into command. The night supervisor's face had gone pale. "Who taught you to do that?" Megan didn't answer. She pulled off her gloves, disposed of them in the biohazard bin. Her hands were steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The difference between muscle memory and the person she'd chosen to become, caught in the same moment, impossible to separate. "I need to clean this room," she said. It was the only thing a nurse would say. It was the only thing she could say without the entire hospital understanding that something had fractured tonight, that the person who'd performed an emergency pericardiocentesis with the composure of someone who'd done it before wasn't someone who'd learned it in an online certification course. The security footage would show everything. Her hand positioning, her anatomical certainty, the way she'd known without hesitation exactly how many milliliters to draw, exactly how much pressure the needle needed before it would pierce the pericardium. Any cardiologist watching that tape would understand immediately that this wasn't a lucky guess. This was training. This was experience. This was someone who should never have been cleaning surgical rooms. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that as Megan stood alone in room 414, running her hands under the sink to wash away Captain Rivera's blood, she understood what came next. Dr. Hargrove would see that tape. He would understand what it meant. And he would understand that his leverage over her had just evaporated, because you couldn't humiliate someone into quiet submission once you'd proven she could save a life with instruments the hospital didn't even know she knew how to use. He would escalate. And this time, he wouldn't fight alone. Within 2 hours of the code, Dr. Hargrove's phone was in his hand. Not angry. Methodical. He stood in his office with the door open just wide enough for Megan to see him through the hallway's glass panels, his smile practiced and patient as he dialed the number he'd been saving for exactly this moment. His former residency director answered on the second ring. They'd trained together at Johns Hopkins 17 years ago, back when Hargrove still believed in medicine instead of hierarchies. That was before Hargrove learned that power flowed upward, that loyalty was currency, that one well-placed conversation could reshape a career like clay in skilled hands. "Richard," Hargrove said, voice smooth as oil on water. "I'm calling because I have a personnel concern. One of my nurses just performed an advanced procedure way outside her scope. Pericardiocentesis. With a spinal needle. No supervision, no attending present." A pause. A laugh from the other end that Hargrove returned. "Exactly. I'm worried about her stability. 3 years here, quiet, competent, too competent, if you understand me, and then something like this." He glanced toward the hallway where Megan was charting, unaware. "I need to know if there were any red flags in her previous employment. Mental health concerns, maybe? Boundary issues? The kind of thing that doesn't show up on paper." Megan felt the weight of his gaze even without looking up. She knew what this was. She'd seen it before, not in hospitals, but in military ops rooms when a commander decided you'd become a liability instead of an asset. When the narrative shifted. When allies became architects of your isolation. The calls kept coming. One to St. Mary's Medical Center in Seattle where she'd worked her first nursing job. Another to Harborview Medical Center in Washington where she'd done her second rotation. Each time, the conversation was the same, concerned, measured, the voice of a mentor worried about a troubled colleague. Each time, Hargrove positioned himself where she could see him through glass, where the power differential was visible in the simple geometry of a closed door and open blinds. His smile never wavered. He even waved once, friendly, as if they were allies in some shared concern about her welfare. By evening, an outside patient safety investigator named Margaret Chen had been contracted through the hospital's legal counsel. She arrived the next morning with a laptop and an expression that suggested she'd seen enough institutional cover-ups to recognize the pattern before anyone said it aloud. 3 years of charts. Every single chart Megan had touched. Every medication she'd documented. Every patient note, every vital sign entry, every procedure she'd assisted with. Chen set up in a conference room adjacent to the main floor, close enough that staff could watch her work, far enough that no one could claim they weren't aware of the investigation. Megan continued her shift as if the walls weren't closing in. She'd learned something in Kandahar about managing fear while maintaining function. Compartmentalization was a survival skill, not a character flaw. Hand steady on 4 lines. Voice level when answering call bells. She even made a joke to one of the phlebotomists about needing coffee so strong it required a DEA license. The phlebotomist, a kind woman named Sarah who'd always treated her fairly, had almost smiled before catching herself. Almost. Fear was contagious, and Megan was becoming patient zero. The break room cleared when she entered on her 3rd shift after the code. She'd expected it. The staff had received the message. The investigator was coming, the legal team was involved, the attending physician had concerns about her stability. Nobody wanted to be associated with that. Not when Hargrove had board connections. Not when a recommendation from him could tank your career trajectory. Not when one photograph, one email, one unfortunate memory could be twisted into evidence of poor judgment. She sat alone with her lunch and watched the fluorescent lights buzz overhead. The sandwich tasted like cardboard. Everything tasted like cardboard now. On day 48 after the save, she'd counted. Margaret Chen finished her review. 217 charts analyzed. 432 interventions documented. 0 protocol violations. 0 medication errors. 0 evidence of anything except excellence executed quietly. The report arrived on Hospital Administrator David Preston's desk on a Tuesday morning at 6:51 a.m. Preston read it twice. He then called Hargrove into his office. By that afternoon, Megan was being escorted out of Oak Creek Memorial by 2 security officers whose names she never learned. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The words came from Preston's mouth, but they were shaped by Hargrove's phone calls, molded by his network, weaponized by his patience. She'd performed a procedure outside her scope of practice. It didn't matter that she'd saved Captain Rivera's life. It didn't matter that Chen's investigation had found nothing. It didn't matter that 3 nurses had come forward, quietly, carefully, to say they'd seen her hands move and known she was doing something no nurse should be able to do. What mattered was that she'd challenged a hierarchy. Megan cleared her locker in 15 minutes. Her badge went into the plastic security envelope. Her stethoscope, her pen light, her compression socks still carrying the smell of bleach. And then her hand found the inside of her jacket lining, where the faded unit patch was sewn. Delta Force. Her unit. The only physical proof that she'd been someone. That she'd saved lives in places where the cost was measured in ways the hospital didn't understand. She ran her thumb across the embroidered insignia, the same motion she'd made 1,000 times over 3 years whenever the weight of invisibility became too much to carry. The rain started before she reached the bus stop. Not a gentle Portland rain, but sheets of it, the kind that made the city look like it was dissolving. She stood beneath the shelter with her cardboard box, the one the security officer had handed her like it might explode. Inside, her cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from a nurse named Jessica on her 1-year anniversary. A dying succulent that had survived 3 years of neglect. And a photograph of her unit from 2009, 22 faces arranged in 3 rows, half of them now gone. Not all killed. Some just scattered across the country, carrying their own secrets, their own scars. The unit patch pressed against her ribs as she stood in the rain, the stitching worn smooth from years of her fingers finding it. Proof. Memory. The only thing that proved she wasn't just a nurse who'd stepped outside her scope. She was something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something that frightened institutional power structures enough that they'd retaliated before anyone even asked what she'd really done or why her hands knew how to save a man from a condition that should have killed him in 90 seconds. A stranger approached with an umbrella. She shook her head. The umbrella stayed anyway, held over her by someone whose face she didn't register. She appreciated the gesture the way she appreciated everything now, distantly, like something happening to someone else. The water ran down her face and neck, soaking through her scrubs that she'd forgotten to change out of. She didn't care. She couldn't care. Caring required the belief that anything mattered, and 3 years of invisibility followed by 2 days of persecution had burned through that particular reservoir. Her phone vibrated. A text from her sister, "Where are you?" "Mom wants to do dinner Sunday." Megan typed back, "Working late." Rain check. The lie came easily. Everything came easily now except the truth. She was down to $67 in her checking account. Her rent was due in 9 days. Her car needed tires. And somewhere in a glass-walled office at Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Hargrove was already making the next call, already positioning himself to ensure that her name became so toxic that no hospital would touch her. That was the true power of institutional authority, not the ability to fire you, but the ability to make sure nobody else would hire you. The rain hammered down on the umbrella held by the stranger. Lightning cracked over the city, brilliant and violent, and Megan closed her eyes. She thought about Kandahar. She thought about the weight of Captain Rivera's body as she dragged him behind the Humvee. She thought about all the other bodies she'd carried, all the lives she'd held in her hands when everything else had failed, when the only thing standing between survival and a flag-draped coffin was a woman who knew how to make impossible decisions in zero-light conditions. She opened her eyes. The stranger with the umbrella was gone. In his place, from somewhere beyond the rain-soaked veil of the city night, came a sound. Low at first. Then louder. The rhythmic percussion of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm, the kind of sound that was supposed to belong to a different part of her life. The part she'd buried. The part that was supposed to stay buried. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The ER doors burst open at 11:48 a.m., and the stretcher came through like violence itself, a man with a through-and-through gunshot wound to the abdomen, bleeding through 3 trauma dressings, his voice fracturing the sterile air before the nurses could even move him to obey. He was screaming in Pashto, then broken English, his eyes wide and searching the fluorescent-lit chaos like he was hunting for a ghost. "Senior Chief O'Brien, she is here?" The woman who killed Khalid and saved the captain. The attending physician froze. 2 nurses exchanged glances. The cardiac monitor in the nearest room beeped its indifferent rhythm, and nobody moved. Captain Rivera's daughter had been sitting in the visitors' lounge on the 4th floor, drinking cold coffee and staring at her father's chest rising and falling on the monitors, when her phone buzzed with a text from her friend working trauma that day. The message had no context, just a recording of those words. Her face went pale. Not confused pale. Knowing pale. The kind of pale that comes when you've just connected a puzzle piece you didn't know existed. She stood up, hand shaking, and pulled up her father's chart on her phone, scrolling through admission notes from 3 years ago, looking for any mention of a pericardiocentesis, of an emergency, of a name. Then she called Megan. Not the hospital. Not security. Megan directly, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Megan arrived within the hour. She'd been at the bus stop, still holding that cardboard box with the cracked mug and the dying succulent, when the call came through. She'd dropped everything, literally. The box sat on the bench behind her, abandoned. Her hands had moved on their own, getting her back into the car, her body remembering the protocol before her mind caught up. At Oak Creek Memorial's administrative office, a classified file was waiting on the mahogany conference table. Megan read it standing up, her hands moving line by line, her breath the only sound in the room. 3 bronze stars. 1 silver star. 17 combat rescues documented. The name of every single one listed in clinical detail, including Captain James Rivera, extracted under fire on September 14, 2012, from a position 4.2 kilometers northeast of Kandahar airfield. The file trembled slightly, not her hands, but the tremor of the air around her, like the room itself was adjusting to a truth it had been denying for 3 years. By noon, a man in tactical gear walked into that same conference room, and the hospital's entire executive board sat up straighter, a reflex older than anyone in the room. He introduced himself with a call sign, Breaker, 3rd Squadron, Naval Special Warfare Command, and he moved to the head of the table like he'd always belonged there. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien carried out 17 combat rescues in Kandahar, including Captain Rivera, over a span of 40 months. She holds the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for valor. She also holds 2 Purple Hearts and the distinction of being one of the most decorated enlisted operators in JSOC. He paused, letting that land. The fact that she has been teaching you people how to check a blood pressure while you treated her like a mistake is something your institution needs to reckon with. The hospital administrator's face had gone the color of old snow. Then the FBI liaison stood. She had credentials that meant something different than the SEAL's presence, legal weight, federal authority, the kind that makes lawyers nervous. Ms. O'Brien's service in Kandahar was part of a classified operation authorized at the highest levels of the Pentagon. Her subsequent anonymous placement in the civilian sector was part of a protected witness program initiated after she provided testimony in a federal investigation regarding military contractor fraud and illegal weapons trafficking. The liaison paused, her eyes moving across the faces of every hospital executive in the room. That testimony resulted in 3 indictments and 1 conviction carrying a 17-year sentence. Her presence here was meant to be anonymous for her safety. That anonymity has been compromised. Dr. Hargrove had been sitting in the back corner of the boardroom, his phone in his hand, his face already shifting toward the expression of a man calculating escape routes. Then the IT specialist stood. Marine Corps veteran, tattoo visible on his neck despite his polo shirt, voice like someone who'd seen people die because of paperwork. Dr. Hargrove attempted to delete security footage from the trauma bay on the day of Captain Rivera's cardiac arrest. The deletion request was logged at 14:33 on the day of the emergency, approximately 6 hours after the procedure that saved the patient's life. Every frame has been preserved and forwarded to the Oregon Medical Board, the Hospital Accreditation Committee, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The specialist looked directly at Dr. Hargrove. All of it. Every second. Including the moments you watched her save a man's life while you stood behind glass doing nothing. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system working overhead, the low electrical hum of machines that don't care about human status or professional reputation. Dr. Hargrove's face didn't stay composed. It shattered. He stood up, knocking his chair backward with a sound like a rifle crack against tile, and his voice came out fractured and desperate. This is a setup. She's a fraud. She doesn't have credentials, she performed surgery without authorization, she's a danger to patients, his voice climbed higher with each sentence, spiraling into panic, and the SEAL team leader simply looked at him the way someone looks at a child having a tantrum. You're done, sir. Your medical license is under federal review. Your actions constitute obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. The Portland Police Department is currently executing a warrant for your residence. The room remained silent. Dr. Hargrove's hands were shaking. He tried to speak again, but nothing came out except a strangled sound, and then he was moving toward the door, and 2 federal agents were moving to intercept, and his face had the expression of a man watching his entire life compress into a single terrible moment of clarity. 6 months later, Megan stood at the podium in Oak Creek Memorial's newly renovated emergency department. They'd added a 17-bed trauma unit, a dedicated PTSD support program, and a veterans care initiative funded by 3 Navy SEAL foundations and 1 very angry woman with a federal pension. The hospital administrator was announcing her new title, Director of Emergency Services. The position came with a salary increase, a private office, and every resource she'd need to rebuild the department's culture from the ground up. She was wearing scrubs under her white coat. She'd insisted on that specifically. I'm here to practice medicine, she'd told the board during the hiring discussion, not to sit in meetings. Captain Rivera stood in the front row, fully recovered now, his chest expanding and contracting without the ventilator that had been his constant companion for 3 weeks post-arrest. When Megan stepped down from the podium, he stepped forward and saluted her, the Navy kind, the kind that means something deeper than respect. His fist came up to his chest, and then he extended his arm, pulling back his sleeve to reveal the tattoo on his forearm, her name, the letters clear and permanent. "Twice," he said quietly. "You saved my life twice. Once in Kandahar. Once at Oak Creek. I'll remember. For the rest of my life, I'll remember." He smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, that smile reached his eyes, and it was aimed directly at a woman he finally recognized. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the effort of not collapsing into the weight of being seen after so long in the dark. But Megan held the line. She nodded once, that same measured gesture she'd perfected over 12 years in uniform and 3 years hiding inside one. She turned back to the assembled staff, every single person who'd pretended not to know her, who'd avoided her eyes, who'd crossed to the other side of the break room when she sat down. "We build something different here now," she said, her voice quiet but carrying across the room like a command. "You work with people who've survived things you can't imagine. You treat them like they matter. That's the culture. That's non-negotiable." She didn't say anything about Dr. Hargrove, who by that date was working minimum wage at Portland Community College's Community Education Center, teaching CPR certification classes to teenagers and board office workers, his name tag reading just Steve, his hand shaking slightly whenever someone called him doctor, which they didn't anymore, not once, not ever again. What courage looks like when it operates in silence isn't what anyone expects. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It just shows up, shift after shift, and holds the line while the world moves past, unaware of what it's walking beside. True class is what you do when the lights go out, when nobody's watching, when there's no medal waiting, when the only person who'll ever know the cost is the one paying it. That's the kind of person you want in your hospital, in your life, in the moment when everything stops and the only thing standing between you and the dark is someone willing to remember their training and forget their fear. Megan O'Brien did that twice for one man. She did it every single shift for everyone else. The uniform changed. The mission didn't. So here's the question for you: have you ever worked alongside someone whose true strength was invisible? Have you ever been wrong about who someone really was? Comment below and tell me your story, because I promise you, the strongest people you know are probably the ones you've never really seen.